Good afternoon and welcome to the East-West Center here in Washington. We're delighted to have you for this program on how the trade war is slowing Asia's economic growth. And we thank the Asian Development Bank here in Washington, Jeff Gelman, and of course our main speaker, Dr. Valerie Mercer-Blackman, for offering to do this program. This is an update to the well-known Asian ADB Outlook report, and couldn't come at a better time. We were speaking just a few moments ago about I had just returned from Asia, and throughout the region there is concern, questions, consideration of where things are going on the economic front, and where the trade war between the U.S. and China is going to go. And so there are a lot of unanswered questions, but the ADB is here to help us offer some answers and at least to help us think through some of the future scenarios. So we're delighted to have you, Dr. Valerie Blackman, and appreciate your coming. Now, here's how this runs. We're on live stream today, so we have guests on the camera as well. So this is an on-the-record presentation. And what we'll do is we'll invite Dr. Mercer-Blackman to make a presentation, and she'll go through her presentation roughly about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments from around the table. And we're delighted to have a number of excellent folks monitoring regional economies from both academia, think tanks, and other places. And I'm not sure who else is on the camera as well. But Dr. Blackman, why don't you please begin your presentation? And again, we're delighted to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone, yes, can you hear me? So I know that for the on live stream, it's so very happy to be here. I was at the East-West Center in Hawaii in February. Had a really interesting discussion on fiscal policy in Asia, and it's always a pleasure to have some sort of really in-depth discussions with some of them. So very happy to be on the other side of the ocean with you folks again. So
and February is a good time to be in our Honolulu office.
Absolutely, that was appreciated.
I must say, yeah.
Good timing.
Well
So I'm Valerie Mercer-Blackman. I work in the macro research division, research department of the ADB in Manila, and so I've done a lot of some of the analysis that we've done on the trade conflict, but as you know, this report covers all of our 45 developing member countries and tries to look at sort of the overview of what is happening in the region. It's a short-term analysis for the next 1 to 2 years. We also always do have a theme chapter, which is on a sort of more long-term issue in depth. This year it was about urbanization, and I'm going to just spend a couple of slides telling you very quickly what was discussed there and what were some of the results. But most of my talk will be focused on the outlook for the region, the trade conflict, of course, the impact of the trade conflict, and also just a few remarks on the risks to that outlook. So this is, again, from most of it based on the Asian Development Outlook update. Our main report comes out in April. It has projections for every country and the region for that particular year and the following year. And then here we update those projections. So it's based on that. Some of you may have attended some of the talks by the chief economist, and if you were here in the last April for that, you will see some of the themes and how we were looking at it now. So here are the key messages. I'll begin by summarizing it. Our forecast for developing Asia is revised down from 5.4% in 2019 to 5.5% in 2020. The region's largest economy, the People's Republic of China, will see further moderation, as will the more open economies in East and Southeast Asia. Growth in the second largest economy, India, is also slowing, primarily due to domestic reasons. Inflation is going to pick up slightly due to food prices, but still remain muted at 2.7% in 2019 and 2020. Downside risks to the East. Again, the trade conflict explains a large part of what is going on. And then finally, and this is getting a little bit into the theme chapter, that our sort of a main conclusion of that chapter is that Asia needs to realize the promise of cities as engines of growth and job creation. So this is our forecast for the region. As you can see, growth prospects in developing Asia have dimmed even relative to the outlook. So in 6 months, you've seen a fairly large revision of the numbers. The blue line excludes the newly industrialized economies of Hong Kong, China, Taipei, China, the Republic of Korea, and Singapore. So those are countries that, because they're very advanced, they tend to grow much less than countries that are emerging markets. So that's why without those countries, you have much larger growth. Of course, a lot of it is driven by China. As you know, China comprises about 60% of developing Asia's gross national income. It's China. So a lot of these numbers are very influenced by what happens in China. The next biggest is India, which is about 11%. And you could see that we had originally expected 6.2%, which would have been mostly due to the trade escalation during that time, up to April, which is what we knew at the time. You may recall that there was a truce in December of 2018 between China and the U.S. to come up with some negotiations and to not have any tariffs until they came with an agreement. And in fact, even as early as, or as late as March of this year, there was already some hopes that there would be an agreement and all tariffs would be removed very soon. And of course, nothing like that happened. So this reflects very much that number. We have a 6% growth this year and next for the region, excluding the newly industrialized economies. Including them, we're expecting 5.4% growth in this year, and just a little bit of an uptick to 5.5%. And I'll explain to you why that may be. And underlying these projections are how we see what's happening in the advanced economies, the three sort of advanced economy areas. We call them the group of three. Slow global activity and trade will lower what we expect for growth, 1.7% for 2019 now, and 1.4% for 2020. Underlying that is a U.S., which has been the fastest growing country really in the developed world. Has some of the numbers, some of the revisions that we've seen have shown that things are not quite as good, even though still not nearly as strong as last year. Last year they were still working on the stimulus effect of the Tax and Jobs Act that you may remember. It went into effect at the beginning of 2018, and there was some momentum built up and very strong growth, especially on the consumption side, and that's beginning to rein in. So we expected that, but in addition to that, some of the other things have lowered the growth prospects there. Euro area, as you know, there is a lot of uncertainty on the Brexit. Looks increasingly likely it's going to be what they call a hard Brexit, which has also created issues on the investment side. And Japan just instituted a tax, a goods services tax, and that's may be having a little bit of an impact on consumption, but so far actually it's not been the case. So that's sort of underlying it, but I think a better part of the story would be, this slide, was the slowing global activity and trade. So these are three indicators that sort of show where we are. The shaded area that you can see basically reflects sort of how the trade escalation, right? So the darker it is, the more we have the trade wars escalated. And there's three lines to look at. The first is the trade volume. And the interesting thing is that even though the tariffs and all of these threats and tit for tats began in March of 2018, you saw a lot of up and down. And that was what they called, there was a lot of front loading of imports. So people knew that there was a tariff coming in July 6th, so they all tried to get their exports out before the bell rang, as they say. And you can also see a very big one in December. After that, things really just have, November before, after that, things really just went sharply south. Again, another possibility after December, you see that there was this truce. People thought that things would get better. People started to export more and thinking about decisions later on. In May, April, May, things started to look bad again. That reflects the PMI is a Purchasing Managers Index, which is supposed to be sort of a leading indicator of what you expect sort of sales and trade to do in the future. It's a composite, and it's a global index done by JP Morgan. And again, you can see the fall there, much more steady, but part of that is the so-called Global Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, which basically shows that really it's the manufacturing sector, the global manufacturing sector, that has suffered the most. The fact that both the blue line is in negative territory means that manufacturers believe that they will be selling less, that they're sort of in a recessionary mode. So, and that happened fairly recently. So we in fact, as you know, the U.S. is also have. If you just look at the U.S. Purchasing Managers Index, you find a very similar similar picture. So this is sort of the backdrop under which Asia is working too. So what does that mean for developing Asia? It's weakening domestic demand. This is a chart that shows you for the most important countries. You have PRC, People's Republic of China, which PRC I will refer to as China from now on. In India, of course, the largest economies are here on your left. Then we have the newly industrialized economies, which are the largest economies, and then the 5 ASEAN countries, ASEAN 5 as they call them. And the first thing to notice is that the biggest part of the bar is the stacked bars is the orange part, which is the consumption growth. So consumption, unlike this sort of idea of 20 years ago of export-led growth, really what's holding the growth in most of Asia is consumption growth. And this is the contribution of consumption to total growth. The little yellow dot shows you the total growth, and you can see each of the 3 demand components, what they contribute. And investment, which used to be, if you look at the 2018 numbers, in many cases was in positive territory. For example, in the case of Philippines and Thailand and Indonesia, a lot of that was public investment, public works. You see that that's also begun to sort of shrink, and in some cases, like China, Hong Kong for other reasons, but for domestic reasons, but many of the other countries, it's actually gone negative. Then you can begin to see that this is a first. We've already seen the impact on investment of some of the trends, and finally, net exports have also in many cases become negative. Not in all, but overall, the story is that you can see if you compare 2018 to the first half of 2019, pretty much everybody has had a weakening demand. Yeah. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, just a question on, in the case of India, for example, your yellow dot is higher. I assume that factors in other factors such as government spending as a contribution to.
That's correct.
Okay.
It's a very good point, because actually India does separate some of the things, but I see also that there's not the gray is not there, so I'll have to check whether that means they usually have they may have, you know, I don't know what the contribution is. I know that they usually have a deficit because they import a lot of commodities, but the prices of commodities go down. That may have grown, so that may affect it, but I'll have to get back to you on that. So very good observation. India numbers, by the way, were revised very recently, so that may have also been an issue. So as I mentioned to you, here you can see a little bit better, the contribution of investment to GDP growth is at its lowest in a decade. In addition, one can see weaknesses in investment cuts across all subregions in developing Asia. So these are all the countries except for Central Asia, which actually had a small pickup. Some of this is due to domestic factors. Like, for example, in the case of the Philippines, it was the delayed passage of 2019 budget slowing infrastructure spending. As you may know, they have a very large infrastructure build program, which has consistently been delayed. And also the external environment, of course. But because the trade conflict and global activity are not expected to turn around anytime soon, then weaknesses in investment is expected to persist in the coming year. Another indicator that we look at closely are the Purchasing Managers Index here of some of the individual countries that report the data, and many are hovering near the threshold. So as you know, 50, if you get a 50, that means that there's no expansion or contraction in the manufacturing sector expected, according to the survey. And you can see that many of them are actually already below 50 or very close to it. In Korea and China, the index fall is its lowest over 2 years, reflecting on weak external demand, particularly for electronics. In Southeast Asia, Cambodia, and Vietnam, you're seeing steady expansion in manufacturing, actually. These are the only 2 countries that are really seeing, unlike everyone else in Asia, are actually seeing a small expansion. And so, and also again, India is an only economy that has the Purchasing Managers Index showing some strength in July, but it's not clear because the recent numbers seem to show that manufacturing, again, not necessarily for the same reasons as East Asia, has also been weakening in India. So what is behind a lot of this? As you know, semiconductors, which are really what is used for electronics, is the backbone of the electronics production sectors are in Asia. And most of the intermediate trade actually is in electronics, machinery, and transportation equipment. So when you see exports and imports of these sorts of things, when they actually start happening, you see an even larger drop in trade. And you can think of electronics as well as 2 things. One is also a leading indicator of what may be happening for manufacturing goods, because so many goods, not just computers and phones like it used to be maybe 2-3 years ago, but pretty much everything, including autos, aeronautics, consumer goods, have chips and have electronics. So it's now becoming sort of much more important as an indicator of all manufacturing. And as you can see, it's been going down. This doesn't show this very well because we wanted to show you how it reflects the cycle relative to 10 years ago. But this actually shows the projections for the rest of the year. And they have been consistently revised downwards by the Semiconductor Industry Association. They expect now a 13.3% drop this year. And what's the reason to worry about this? Well, at this point, you can see there's a cyclical thing. There would have generally been already some sort of, reconfiguration of factories and, getting ready for sort of either the next model of the phone or for something else. And you just don't see that. Everybody is waiting in the sidelines. And that's affecting all sorts of other goods that actually need these electronics. And part of it is, again, just the uncertainty for investors as to what's going on. Another part of it is, consumer demand is still strong, right? So it wouldn't necessarily be that people are suddenly not consuming. But a lot of it is also the fact that the trade is the trade conflict has also become a technology conflict, and you may know that there's a lot of bans and restrictions on Huawei and now some new companies and lots of pronunciations for companies that are very big in high-tech products that is impeding them from really doing business, and this is going straight into the semiconductors numbers. And just to tell you how important semiconductors are for Asia, on the right-hand side, you can see the domestic value added in electronics exports as a share of total exports. So basically what it says is what part of the value of those exports is actually coming from of just electronics. And the developing Asia is itself quite high, 15%, but you can see for some of the East Asian countries, including for China, a quarter of it is due to that. So very important sector for Asia.
Valerie, what do you mean then by escalation? By technology escalation?
Basically, what we see, and I was going to mention that later, after May of this year, when there was the truce broke down and they began to escalate, or even before May actually, you were already seeing non-tariff measures And we actually quantify that in the report, or show the report of all sorts. Well, the biggest is Huawei and the increasing restrictions, even though the ban is being still postponed. But it's the pronunciation that this is going to happen has created a lot of problems. But there have also been things that are not sort of unrelated, like, for example, restricting visas for students in certain high-tech sectors like computer science or robotics and things like that. And anything that is related to 5G technology, I think that it's sort of become a bit of a race.
So you mean the tariff escalation?
Not the non-tariff escalation. So the tariff escalation, yes, we have that, and I'll discuss that later on in more detail. But there's also a new sort of escalation has begun, which is sort of a non-tariff types of measures. For example, in visas for students, for Huawei, for electronic companies. Even this week, there was yet new bans on any American companies that do business, and likewise, Chinese has also been affecting some investors. They just, for example, FedEx was banned, so etc. I mean, there's all sorts of different things going on, but it's clearly been going on, and we believe actually that these kinds of bans can have an even bigger impact on, for example, the semiconductor industry, and certainly a very, very bad impact on innovation, which is more difficult to measure in the medium and long term. So this is to show you how trade, what's happened to trade as a result. This is a trade growth of merchandise exports, merchandise imports for the regions, for our 5 sub-regions. And the only thing to say is clearly you can see the first 7 months of, I think for some 6 months of 2019, you've seen pretty much all exports falling. Some of them are still for Central Asia and South Asia, which are less impacted by the trade conflict, not necessarily. But imports have actually, if you look at the right-hand side, imports have actually dropped by even more. Which has ironically actually improved the trade balance for some of these countries a little bit as a result. So what about the 2 largest economies? We always spend a little bit of time just talking specifically what's going on with China and India. These are, again, the contribution to growth on the demand side on a quarterly basis. And one of the things to notice, as I've just mentioned, is that net exports have actually been, in the case of China, have actually been, the blue part of the bar, have actually been positively contributing to growth, simply because imports, which are very related to, for example, investment and intermediate, especially intermediate imports. In fact, 80% of trade in China and China with the rest of developing Asia is in intermediate goods. So you can see that in these blue bars, imports falling very sharply, and so you have a positive contribution of net exports. And then investment as well has not been growing as quickly as well. In the case of China, which is different to other countries, you're also beginning to see the impact on consumption growth. It's usually been fairly robust, and that's what's really bringing down the number for the total growth to 6.2. As many of you know, the policies, sort of medium-term policies of Chinese government are stability. In the past, they were growing very, very quickly. Now, they would rather have stable and maybe not necessarily too high growth in order to maintain sort of financial stability, which is an area of their economy where they do have some issues. They have very large debt of state-owned enterprises, corporate debt in general, and they are concerned about those issues. So they would rather sort of forego very high growth in order to maintain that stable. And that could impinge a little bit on their ability to say, try to stimulate the economy as a result of the impact of the trade conflict. For example, they did help out with reserve requirements. They have done a little bit of a fiscal stimulus to help, especially sectors that are most affected. Manufacturing had a tax cut, but there's only so much that they can do on the monetary side without creating more debt than there already is. So that's always it's sort of a fine line that they have to walk there. And in the case of India, there's quite contrast. There's a lot of zigzagging around. So India's had a lot of, and since fiscal year 2017 and even before, they've been doing a lot of structural reforms on all kinds of things, on non-performing loans. They're sort of trying to consolidate large banks with lots of non-performing loans. They've liberalized foreign direct investment. They imposed a goods and services tax that is more uniform across all states. Then there was the monetization, demonetization, and trying to get rid of sort of the informal economy, etc. So they're just sort of teething issues that have created a lot of initial uncertainty. But overall, they have been reforms that are going to help the economy. So even though you don't see it here so much, we do expect that these things are going to have a positive impact later on. In the last 4 quarters, you've seen that they're also having, there's also been a reduction in the growth, especially the last quarter with the data that just came out. And just so you know, they have a fiscal year. So what says this is the first quarter of fiscal year 2019 would be the last, I think, of the May to June, but I'll have to check that exactly. But they only work in fiscal years, which has always been something that I have a lot of problems with dealing with. But the point that you can see here is that the private consumption is really also been going down in there. A lot of this is elections-related uncertainty. A lot of this is, again, some uncertainty related to the domestic policies that they've been doing, and not necessarily related to the trade conflict. So these are our growth projections. As you can see, the arrows are all going down, the red arrows, which means that there have been downward revisions, and not only downward revisions, but that we're expecting compared to that we're expecting these revisions to continue into 2020. So looking across the region more broadly, if you start from the left-hand side of the table, the East Asia and Southeast Asia, they're the most open economies, and they have the strongest linkages to China. And they're the most integrated in global supply chains. So as a result, they will be the hardest hit by the trade conflict, especially in 2019. Especially Singapore has had a huge decline in relative to what we expected before, from 2.6 to 0.7 growth in 2019 now expected, and that will continue into 2020. Again, this is a hub for logistics, a hub for trade, manufacturing, semiconductors. So this is it's sort of a little microcosm of what is going on in that sector. The only country that seems to be doing same as before are Vietnam and Malaysia, and they also are expected to continue growing as we thought before. As I will mention earlier, they are benefiting from what we call trade redirection. I'll talk about that later. And then we also have countries like Thailand and the Philippines that, in addition to public investment, have also had a lot of uncertainty on for the private investors of all this that's going on, and is having an impact on their growth. Moving on to South Asia, here on the right-hand side, Bangladesh, the fastest country, fastest growing economy in Asia, probably in the world, has had really a surge in investment, a lot of it, some of it trade redirection as well. And India, as I mentioned before, we're expecting from 7.2 growth to go to 6.5 in this fiscal year, and then 7.2 the following year. So again, this year is a little bit of a misnomer for India, could pick up next year. Pakistan, as you know, has had a lot of balance of payments problems. They have a very strict IMF program, and a lot of this growth is because of the tightening. In the terms of Central Asia, and by the way, I should mention here that the economies we show are the largest economies. Of course, they don't include some of the smaller countries in each of the sub-regions. So for Central Asia, the largest countries are Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. And both of them had surprises on the upside, a lot of public investment going on. And many of them are not only had benefited already from the price, but actually from volume of some of the oil and some of the other natural resources that they produce, that they export. And then in the Pacific, which is a tiny part of Asia, of course, the biggest economy is Papua New Guinea. It's 70% of the Pacific Islands' gross national income. And they had a big accident due to an earthquake of LNG plant last year. And the recovery and reconstruction of that is going much better than they thought. And so that's really helping to pick up growth there. So not only were they already expected to grow 3.7, but again, that will be 4.8. Next year, not so much, because that will have already been sort of the base effect would have already come through. So this is now sort of going to move on to a little bit about what's happening on the financial side, so the currency markets and what has been the effect of the trade conflict. After strengthening in early 2019, the major equity markets, and this is for China, it's in the orange bar. The newly industrialized economies, sort of a composite, is the blue bar, and for the ASEAN 5s, it's the gray bar. India, it's not been moving so much, but you can see that from January 2019 to April, May, especially for China, you saw this very strong confidence. The equity markets were growing. Then you see the small fall, but then you begin to see much more volatility. So this just shows you some of the effects that we expect to see, the reaction, shall we say, of the equity markets to some of these issues when tensions escalate. And bond spreads as well is another indicator of how these financial markets are telling us what's happening. They've widened quite a bit compared with news of the trade conflict. And sometimes you can even see these changes weekly. So you see some of the spikes, and a lot of the times they're actually related to the events or to the announcements that happen in that particular week. And currencies, which are, of course, very important. As you can see, in general, not on all, but there's been a depreciation since 2018 as a result of the trade conflict. Of course, when there's less trade, that tends to create depreciation of the currencies vis-a-vis the dollar. Now, for 2018, a lot of this was not so much a depreciation of Asian currencies, but it was more an appreciation of the U.S. of the dollar. So it wasn't just happening with Asia; it was happening with other countries. As you know, in the middle of last year, there was also a big ruck-up with Turkey and Argentina's currencies, and that had an impact also on emerging markets in Asia. So that was sort of the big increase, escalation for East Asia especially. Then again, you had between January and May, not a lot of action. June, July, August, as the trade conflict escalates, a huge depreciation, especially of the renminbi, the Chinese currency. And then for South Asia, much less so. In the case of Pakistan, again, this is more related to sort of internal issues, but they've had a very, very large depreciation of their exchange rate. And then the ASEAN 5, which are sort of less developed markets, have sort of had different issues. Thailand has had other internal issues, but in general, there's been a small appreciation. So let's turn now to the trade conflict. This is sort of a chart that shows you the chronology of the trade conflict. And let me just explain what these things are, what these nice bubbles are. The dotted circle gives you sort of a measure of the total value or the size of the imports from the U.S. So in the top you have U.S. imports from China, and the dotted one sort of tells you what are the total imports. The value of total imports in 2018 was 539.7 billion, and the same thing for China, which is 5 times less about. Their value of imports from the U.S. was 155.1 in 2018, and that's what those bubbles reflect. And throughout since the 2018, you had an escalation, but you can see that the colored circles, which actually show the value of the goods that are subject to tariffs, was quite a bit smaller than the sort of the total. And not only that, but it was most of them were about 25%, maybe a little bit less of a tariff. So that the darker the circle, you can see on the legend on the right-hand side, that gives you the size of the average tariff of those imports. So in 2018, we had something. Now you can see in 2019, of course, a lot of it has happened in the second half, how big those circles have gotten and how they really are covering everything. So by the end of, there's a lot of tariffs that have been imposed. So just for some of you that are not so familiar with the chronology of this, a lot of the tariffs in 2018 there was a lot of threats in March. There was always a tit for tat. So U.S. would threaten, China would say that they would take the same amount of goods, 16 billion, and say, okay, we'll take 16 billion and we'll put 25% tariff on that. So there was about 2 incidences of a sort of escalation in 2018. In 2019, things got very messy. And as you know, there was also, the U.S. also started threatening to impose tariffs on Mexico, on the European Union. Those threats are still actually in the books. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office still has everything ready to go, so to speak. Some of them is on auto and auto parts. Others are on the aircraft industry, saying that they are subsidizing the aircraft industry in Europe, and so therefore they're going to impose tariffs on, whiskey, wine, all the cheese, all these sorts of things, and so those are, and then in the case of China, of course, everything was going very well. They were going to have an agreement. Somehow things got off, and so they just decided on May 10th of May, they announced a huge increase in tariffs to 200, and also they basically raised the tariff rate to 25%. And then in August, this is quite interesting, China announced 117.4 billion in tariffs, in new tariffs. But actually those 117.4 were, most of those goods were already being levied, taxed at different rates. They just switched the rates around. So China is being much more strategic. They are saying, well, we really need these products from the US, so we're not going to tax those. We'll tax those at 5%. But the ones that we don't care about so much and that we can get from somewhere else, we'll tax those higher. So they kind of did a reshuffling, and the US got very upset at that, and immediately they raised, they announced an increase in tariffs all the way to December. They were going to put them all immediately, but there were a lot of consumption goods, so they didn't want to affect the Christmas shopping. So some of these are actually going to come in December. And if you count all of those tariffs that the U.S. has imposed, 99.7% of imports from China to the U.S. will be under a tariff, with an average tariff rate of 22.2%. In the case of China, about 77.7% will be under tariff, and with a tariff rate of about 17%. And again, this is still a much smaller number altogether because Chinese imports are lower. So this is a picture of the tariffs. The green area basically shows what hadn't happened as of the time of publication. There are some negotiations going on this week, as you all know. We're not particularly optimistic about the outcome, simply because it's not really clear what's being negotiated at this point. So, there's not, and we reflect that in our risk assessment. So what has that done to trade? Well, we've actually looked at the number of the particular sets of goods at the two-digit H categories that were impacted by the tariffs, especially since the middle of 2018, and see what's happened to them. So if you look at the U.S. imports from China, they have actually gone down in these four goods that have been most affected quite a bit, and they continue to go down all the way to July. Of course, we don't have data for the things that have been imposed recently, but we would have to look at that later. And interestingly enough, there has been trade redirection. If you take exactly those sets of goods and you look at U.S. imports from other developed countries in developing Asia, newly industrialized economies, ASEAN 5 and India, you see that those same goods have mostly increased. There's been a growth of the imports from those countries. So there's been clear trade redirection away from China, by the U.S., away from China to other countries in Asia. And of course, as you well know, the trade balance in the U.S. has continued to be very high, simply because there's still a lot of demand within the U.S. for imports. And maybe they're switching from one country to the other, but they will continue to grow. How about the Chinese? Well, if we look at the left-hand side, Chinese tariff-affected imports have also gone down. So they're below the zero line, some of them much earlier than before. except for electrical and optical equipment. And as you may recall, I mentioned that the Chinese have a lot of sets of different tariffs that they impose, and they impose them, for example, like some specific electrical and optical equipment from the United States, they impose very low tariffs. They even gave some waivers. So that one has not done that badly, and in fact, you can see that it was increasing a little bit up to the middle of the year. Now it's dropped more because, up to the first quarter. Well, we don't have the same chart of whether there's been a redirection because we don't have the same numbers from the Chinese authorities. But you could just see from looking at the Chinese imports from Japan and from developing Asia. This is the different groups of countries that compared to 2017, 2018, and even the first half of last year, imports have actually fallen, right? So unlike the U.S., where you see a fall from China and an increase from other countries in Asia, here you see a fall from everyone. And that, again, reflects what I mentioned, which is that because there's less demand for Chinese exports, they in turn are demanding less from the rest of developing Asia because they get most of their inputs from the rest of developing Asia. There's been a lot of slow process where China has been sort of going up the value chain, and their production bases of sort of lower, low-cost goods that are actually being set up in the rest of developing Asia. So that has actually continued, especially if you look at the newly industrialized economies that really depend on China. And this is very much the same picture that I showed you before. These are U.S. imports from different countries. So again, the top left-hand quadrant shows you, again, from the U.S., and these are totals. So it actually shows you the totals by groups of goods, I guess. A large part of it, electronics and machinery. And then 3 countries that have actually, so it was a 12% decline, but 3 other countries, almost 10% for the rest of the developing Asia. And then you have Vietnam. We don't have here Thailand, but it has happened also to Thailand. Vietnam and Bangladesh have seen a huge surge in their imports of the same goods. Bangladesh, as you know, a very large percentage of their imports are textiles and garments. And so that's why that's the yellow part there. So now I'm just going to, yeah, sure. Sure.
So how much of that growth in the Vietnam trade is actually redirected from China?
Well, it would be a little bit, we can only guess, but it's the same, we can only go down to a certain detail level, but it's the same within the same family group. It's the same types of groups of goods that they import from China. So for example, electronics is something that is being redirected from China to Vietnam. But electronics has a lot of things in it, so we don't know exactly if it's the same equipment, but it's most likely. There are stories of actually firms moving to Vietnam, especially from China, but also Japan has been moving, Korea, Taipei. All of these countries economies are moving their factories to Vietnam. So we know these things are happening, and we also see in the trade data that the same categories of goods are moving to Vietnam. So we believe it's a large part of it.
Sorry, I guess what I was referring to is how much of it is being categorized as a Vietnam product.
Relabeling. Relabeling versus redirection.
Yeah, originating out of China, but
right.
Classified as Vietnamese.
I mean, that's always an issue, even before you had this trade conflict, just in the sense that, there's a lot of local content rules, and it's like, it can't be more than 30%, so there were always these issues going on, especially in Asia, where actually, if you look at a particular product, the value added of that product can come from like 10 different countries. So it was always an issue. There was actually a time when there were stories of people trying to do this, and the Vietnamese authorities were afraid that they would get attacked, so they started to clamp down on it. But there's not been really a strong thing. Generally what's happened is that these large holding companies, or these very large firms, they just put a factory in Vietnam. So it's not redirection, right? It's not really just relabeling and calling something that's actually made in China, calling it Vietnamese. That sort of redirection would be a very small part of it.
So in the previous slide, you showed that there was an increase of imports, American imports from Southeast Asia, ASEAN 5, yes. But the bulk of it, a lot of it is coming from Vietnam, which is your next slide. So what about the remaining ASEAN countries? Have they seen an increase, a decrease?
Yeah, so
I can't quite marry these two graphs.
right. No, Thailand have seen an increase. Malaysia, yes, a little bit. So there's two effects going on, and I was going to explain that a little bit later. But one effect is just simply the fact that this trade conflict is creating a lot of uncertainty. People are postponing business, they're putting things on hold, they're not investing, they're not exporting. So you're going to see sort of an overall decline in everything, with the exception of Vietnam. Maybe Vietnam has also seen sort of a pickup in all these sorts of things, but everyone else. But at the same time, underlying that, you see a lot of people investing already in Thailand, in the ASEAN 5, basically. Less so Indonesia, Philippines a little bit, but Philippines doesn't have a very the manufacturing sector is not quite as strong as some of the other ASEAN countries, or is not quite as large as their services, their business services. So in these other countries, you do see already people relocating their factories. Of course, that production is not going to show up in the first half of for data up to June or July of 2019. So, for example, let me see, Cambodia is having a huge increase as well, out of memory. Malaysia's having an increase, not quite as large, but a lot of it was because there was a drop at the beginning of the year, now it's sort of picking up. So, different things. The one that we see clearly, I think, more is Vietnam, perhaps Cambodia. Taipei, and the other thing is, for example, East Asia, because a lot of these countries like Korea are actually becoming also the ones that have their factories set up in different countries. So Samsung and Hyundai is setting up their factories. Japan as well has huge investments in Thailand. So you're actually seeing that they're also moving there for indirect reasons as well. Taipei, China is moving them back to their country. Foxconn, for example, moved back. So there's a lot of moving around and shifting around and reallocating and everything. And right now we only have the trade data. We have a little bit of evidence we show of that, including the fact that there's been huge increases in FDI
What
to
is the source of your
ASEAN.
BOT data?
I'm sorry?
What is the source of your BOT data?
This is the BEC data, which I think is Department of Commerce of the United States. This one here. They have they have it by good and by origin. So.
Just apropos of this discussion on U.S. Southeast Asia and the breakdown of the 10 countries, Malcolm Cook from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies on October 18th will be here from 10 to 11 talking about a new study he's doing on exactly this, the export-import changes in the last 5 years between U.S. and individual Southeast Asian countries in the context of this trade war. So.
Okay, so I guess calls into that. This is a picture of how we see trade today. So 20 years ago, you imposed a tariff on somebody and then they suffered the tariff. Now this is a visualization of the networks and the global value chains and how intertwined really the world is in terms of gross value added. So it shows the 35 countries of the multi-regional input-output table that we produce, and each of the nodes is the global value chain participation. So how much of its trade is actually in value added and how much it participates. It's a sum of the forward and backward links. So either because you provide something to a country or because you demand it. And of course you can see sort of three hubs, right? Three global hubs. China, US, and Germany. And around those countries, you basically see a lot of the major countries in developing Asia. For example, Malaysia, which is and Taipei, which is sort of like right in the middle of China and the US, and huge intertwining of all of these goods. The actual the thickness of the lines, so the lines that go from or the links that go from one to the other, if it's the color of, say, blue, it would mean that the links are stronger in that direction. So, for example, here you see U.S. and Canada. You see both links very strong. That would be the amount of the value added to trade among those countries. And of course, we only show if you have the links if it's more than $10 million of the trade. So this is a representation of the world, which is, I think this is the best picture to show why tariffs don't work. In other words, why they don't have the intended consequence over the country that you expect it to. But it can actually sometimes backfire, or it can affect a whole bunch of other countries as well. Because most goods are now being produced in a series of stages of production, and those stages can be done in many countries, depending on their sort of trade and value-added comparative advantage. So using this, we actually at the ADB tried to produce a little model, trade conflict analysis methodology, using input-output tables and taking advantage of how different sectors are linked. And the objective was to evaluate the global, regional, country, and sector-specific impacts of the current trade conflict. And of course, we looked at various direct channels, and I can tell you some other things that are not taken into account here and things that are. The first is, of course, a direct impact on the tariff. So elasticity. If there's an increase in the price because of a tariff of an import of something, how much will you demand more? You will demand less of it. How much less? How much will you redirect, etc. So that would be the final direct impact on all the countries. The second is the indirect impact via production linkages. So if you are going to demand less cars, then the steel and the sensors and everything else that needs to be used to produce cars will also be demanded less. One that has suffered quite a bit is, for example, or that has been impacted has been the leather industry in Vietnam. They produce most of the seats for cars, apparently, so in the US at least. And then you have trade redirection, which is this idea that what we already also see happening, which is that, well, if it's an easy product and someone else is producing it, in the case of soybeans from the US, now China is actually demanding from Argentina and Brazil a lot of their soybeans. Maybe not the same quality, but most likely it's going to be the same quality. Then I'll get it from somebody else. If it's a product that is difficult for somebody else to produce, like I had a special factory set up in Malaysia for this particular sensor, for this particular Boeing 747, it's going to take a much longer time for that particular product to be, for that factory to be, it's closed down and put elsewhere. So this trade direction effects can take some years to happen, and of course there's some speculation over it. Then we look at three scenarios. The current scenario, which includes all implemented measures as of September 2019. So what is the impact today of what's already happened? A bilateral escalation scenario where 30% tariffs are imposed on all US and PRC trade. So as I already told you, a lot of it is already subject to tariffs, but let's say 100% of it is, and it was 30%. What difference would that make? And finally, a so-called worst-case scenario that adds some of the threats that are already in the books, ready to be implemented whenever there's a reason, which is a 25% tariffs on all auto and auto parts by the US on other countries, which would affect Japan and Europe most likely. And then they would retaliate also with a 25% tariff on US autos and auto parts. We use the multi-regional input-output tables, which covers basically the whole world. We have 35 sectors and 62 countries, plus an additional country called rest of the world. So it really is a global model in the sense that it's just that we can't distinguish between any economy that's not individualized in the model. And it includes 24 economies in developing Asia. And these are the results of the model. As you can see, the conflict adversely affects US, but especially China, but actually the rest of the developing Asia can benefit. And just to make you're seeing this now, but we actually put this in a year ago before we solved trade redirection. So it's not that the reality conformed to the model as opposed to the other way around, I'd like to say. But the first thing to notice is, of course, People's Republic of China will have huge increase, about half percentage point of GDP, just has already been affected by the trade conflict. Now, this does not include uncertainty, which is basically the other businesses that are related holding off investing or exporting or something because they don't know what's going to happen. And those effects are much, much larger. There's some people have done some, we've done some as well, I'll show you, but other people have found quite large impacts of even 1 percentage point of global GDP of uncertainty. So this is only, all else being equal, only the trade effect. There are also sort of countervailing effects like exchange rates. As you know, the renminbi depreciated about 10% against the dollar last year, and the tariffs were about 10% on average. So, maybe there was actually no effect on net on the trade. And then there can be also other effects as well. One thing that's happened in Asia is that they are trying to do many more of these regional agreements, the CPTPP, and all of these agreements they're really rushing to join forces and do more deals with each other. So that's also a countervailing impact of this. But this is, again, not included in the model here. And the final thing that's not included are the non-tariff effects, like the Huawei issues and any kind of effects on technology. We're not going to notice those here. Again, you'll see the impact. Then the second one is the yellow one is what we call the bilateral escalation. So that's 30% across the board tariffs on U.S. and China. Then you would get that about 1 percentage point of GDP of China are affected. And then you would have the auto and auto parts impact, the worst case scenario, which is green. And in the case of China, it's very small because already everything's been affected. So it's just only a small indirect impact. So that's for the first sort of set of bars here, right? The second one is now including the redirection effect. So say in 1 or 2 years, people start moving their factories around. What do you see now? And of course, that does, in some sense, make the total impact a little bit smaller. Not much for China, though. But for the other countries, it makes a difference. For the US, the same effects I was just talking, you would end up with a full effect, especially the auto and auto parts effect, which is sort of the biggest. Right now, it's about 0.3 percentage points of US GDP. Altogether, it would be 0.45 with auto effects. And this would go to about a 0.25 percentage points of GDP if there was some redirection.
Which I can't tell.
I'm sorry, this is the US is the top part. Yes, yeah, that's right. I'm having trouble here. So this is the third quadrant, which is the global effect, the effect on global GDP. It actually looks a lot like the effect on the US. And finally, developing Asia, all of developing Asia, which does benefit. So you see the sort of redirection is the one that really, at the beginning, you're going to see a drop, but with some redirection that can actually benefit. So you can think of the beginning of 2020, the 2019, this year, we're really in this scenario here, right? This is where we are in 2019. We see that this big drop for China and maybe a little bit for the US once everything kicks in. But for most countries except for Vietnam, this is what we're catching in some of the projections.
So can I ask for the U.S.? I mean, I guess, was it a couple of weeks ago or a few days ago that the jobs figures came out? Still pretty strong. Is this a delay that we should expect then as a result of these scenarios working themselves out, and that we will see a job fall off and a real wage decline over the coming year, 2020?
Actually, what you see is, you're right that the jobs report was still positive, but quite a bit less because manufacturing jobs actually fell. And of course, you have this GM issue as well that may have had something to do with it. But manufacturing, not only jobs but output are certainly dropping. We already have the Purchasing Managers Index showing actually falls in sales. And we actually have this also for employment sectorially for the US. And the two ones that suffer are transportation equipment, which is part of manufacturing, of course, and also some of the ones related to electronics, as well as agriculture. Now, in the case of agriculture, it would be, soy farmers and things like that. And as we know, they're getting subsidies and things like that. So we would have to, if we put in the effects of subsidies, it may not be quite as large, but they are, in effect, a lot of them are suffering quite a bit from the soybean drop in soybean sales. So yeah.
And on the Asia question, I mean, the sort of in the diplomatic foreign policy world, Southeast Asia or much of developing Asia sort of, don't make us choose, don't get into conflicts with China is kind of the line. And yet, at least on the trade front, they seem to be benefiting overall. So can that be sustained? I mean, or once this kicks in, both for China and the U.S., there are other drags on the Asian economies, because as you said, much of this growth is tied to the Chinese economy. I think you use the figure of 60%.
That's right, yeah.
So when does that benefit begin to drop as China drops?
Actually, so the drop you see in developing Asia here is what we're seeing now. So you see that you saw the numbers for our projections as well, for others.
For Singapore and
That
others,
Singapore,
yeah, sure.
that's what you're seeing right here. And of course, Singapore is being hit harder than others. East Asia, Korea, all these are being hit hard. So that's what you're seeing here, and that's because they depend a lot on the Chinese economy. These sort of trade and production links are being affected. People are waiting in the sidelines. That's what you see there. But you also see huge investments into ASEAN,
Right.
Especially ASEAN, a little bit less to some of the more advanced East Asian countries. And that's what's going to come into play here, is once those investments actually turn to production, which turn to trade,
Right.
relative to 2018, or relative to a scenario with no trade conflict, this is what you would see. And again, this is sort of theoretical because you're looking at it's not
Scenario
relative
that
to
hasn't
last
happened.
year, but
Right.
relative to, yeah.
Vikram?
Just to be clear, these are deviations from baseline, right? So,
That's right.
So, if you've got a 5 growth rate and deviation from baseline is 0.2%.
Right.
It's nothing.
Well,
It would be 4.8,
Right.
right.
But
That's still small, yes.
yeah, there are many domestic shocks and factors. that
Well, that's
usually compensate for that.
I mean, the question is really not that this isn't happening. The question, at least to me, the question is, what's the weight of this in the overall? Like in the India case, as we were discussing, it seems very small, all of this perturbation on trade and tariffs issues. In the US economy, yeah, it's having some impact. But compared to other factors, relatively modest in the scheme of a, $18 trillion economy or whatever the number is now. And the other thing that is hard to not disentangle from this is how much of this redirection was happening because of more structural factors like Chinese wage growth, labor rate, labor costs, restrictions on the Chinese economy. I know Vikram has things to say about
this
this.
is a model-based output, right? So this is what the model says. What's actually happening? So,
Yeah, this is a trade.
So
It's a trade
don't
model as
confuse
well.
this with reality. Please,
Okay.
that's very important.
So-
No, I'm just trying to think how to
but
account
you
for
have-
these
you have a point.
variables.
It's a good point. So
Because
it's
these things are happening in the real world on labor
Right.
costs and other things have been happening for a decade.
That's right.
I mean, it's extraordinary things. Thailand's not in CPTPP, but the holding up of investment in Thailand is holding up and in fact advancing, because even though labor rates in Thailand are relatively high compared to most of Southeast Asia, they're still lower than China. And there's a pretty good infrastructure to hold manufacturing and supply chains, right?
So there's a recent survey, sorry,
Sorry. No.
out of 56 companies that relocated over the last 6 months from China, only 2 went to Indonesia, 2 to India, 11 to Thailand,
Right.
or something like 28
To Vietnam.
to Vietnam.
Yeah, sure.
So the differences are huge.
Right, yeah. No, I mean, so to answer your questions, again, this is just trade. Uncertainty, we think, is having a much bigger effect. So, for example, that's going to show up in domestic investment, and we do see it showing up in domestic, at least, I haven't looked at the US, but I understand it also has had some effect. At least domestic investment in those sectors in developing Asia seems to be already affected from this. So, and this is not, the investment is not being shown here because investment is going to presumably have some effect later on or thereafter. This is just the impact of the less trade or more trade on the value added of the economy and the GDP. So, and we don't have we do have an estimate for it, but others, IMF, Federal Reserve Board, have come up with pretty high impacts of uncertainty of even 1 percentage points of GDP, of global GDP. So, these are difficult, very, very difficult things to measure. There was also some impact of financial market equity falls and all sorts of other things. But this is tangible, and this is something that you can sort of trace back, and this is for every fall in value added for a particular sector, you can see how many jobs would be affected. So it's a little bit more tangible analysis, but it doesn't explain everything. And of course, again, this is not in some ways, this is not time. We're not timing this in some ways. But I can just tell you this is a direct impact, so it's something that's most likely happening already. The first sort of group of bars here.
Sure.
And on your second question, yeah, I mean, completely agree. This tendency of moving to South Asia, especially, these countries you mentioned, is not new. It's just has been a huge acceleration in the last 2 years. So it's really catalyzed the process. Suddenly China's like, being nice with everybody, and when you need money, it's even more than before. Before it was very much related to labor costs. It was also related to the growth of value chains, in which large multinationals were just looking everywhere and saying, okay, labor is cheap here, taxes are low here, so this is the way I'm going to, was all this sort of spreading out of production. So that's a long-term effect. And in fact, now that we've sort of gotten to the end of that, that had progressed a lot, now this is really affecting all of that. All these chains are being affected. So that's the issue. Of course, this is a moving. We did this in December, and we have to keep updating it because every time there's a new. Yes.
Are you seeing governments in ASEAN or in the region coming to ADB looking to play that counter-cyclical role already? Are they?
You mean counter-cyclical in that, we need help because loans?
Yeah, you were just projecting a few slides earlier, global growth is down. There's just Malaysia and Vietnam are the only ones that are steady. So is the impact not yet large enough or severe enough that they're not coming to the bank, or are they coming to the bank already? And also I wanted to, you showed some numbers about Central Asia, which is a big recipient of the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'm wondering, how that plays in those Central Asian countries. It looks like they're importing more from China than they are exporting. So is the Belt and Road more of a one-way? How is that overlaid, I guess, with those countries?
Right. So on your first question, I mean, there's been downgrades, of course, but you can see that still Asia's growing very quickly. So, and in fact, some of the smaller, like Cambodia and Laos, for example, are growing really quickly as well, with sort of neighboring Vietnam. So, it's still not. We're still not at a situation where you have to. It's not like, you're going to have to. There are issues with debt. Some of these countries have very high debt, especially East Asia has a very high private debt. So those are concerns we have. But for example, East Asian countries are quite wealthy. They certainly don't need our help. And from here, the countries that would are much smaller. They're a very small part of the total GDP of developing Asia, and they're not really they're still growing. So we've not actually seen that. I mean, projects are still, as you know, most of our loans, about 80 to 85% are infrastructure loans, water and energy and these sorts of things, and they are more long-term related than sort of quick, we need, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, as you know, do have an IMF programs, which, directly we're supporting, but those are very domestic issues. With regard to your question on Central Asia, in fact, there's still very much, although there has been a growth in links to trade with China, they're still very much part of Russia. So their links are still quite strong with Russia. And commodities are still a very important part of their sort of overall well-being. And things like, discoveries of new oil fields and things still seem to matter much more for the economy. And at least Kazakhstan, which is the largest, they still have very large oil fund, things like that. So they're still not really as open as some of the other economies that they would really be affected as much on this. And the Belt and Road Initiative, I think it's still moving. If anything, it's been slowing down a bit because it's not so. It's obviously there's big expansion plans, but it's not big enough to sort of throw your GDP up very much for some of those countries. So. Yeah,
One
sure.
more, but yeah. Hi. Here in the U.S., we have a phenomenon occurring where retail sales have been severely hurt. We see store closings everywhere. It's the internet, obviously, putting an awful lot of competitive pressure on the retail trade. Now, retail has been one of the big booming industries throughout Asia as the middle class grew and their incomes grew. Do you see any signs of that other effect yet, though, where the retail trade could be hurt by the internet?
You talked about consumption, but I
right.
don't know where retail fits into
Like
that.
Alibaba and I should know the one in the Philippines. But I mean, these platforms have been growing really fast as well in Asia. The one in India is very popular because you can pay with cash. So
Right?
Yeah, so the growth rate of digital trade is growing at 27% a year,
Throughout Asia.
Southeast Asia.
Southeast.
that's right. It's really big.
Phenomenal growth. But it's still such a small part of GDP, it's not making much of an impact on aggregate GDP. Still something like 2%, and by 2030 it will be 6%.
Of digital.
So that's a good question. You know, the consumer is such a big part of our economy here. What's the relative size in a lot of these Asian economies?
It's growing very quickly, obviously not as large as here. It's growing really quickly, and they have various, whereas here it could grow and expand, but there you have population growth, working age population growth, and therefore more capacity to consume that's still growing sort of from just a developing country, just developing more. So that effect is probably more than outweighing the possible impact of people. I mean, for example, I don't know, this is maybe off the record a little bit, but the Asians love to go shopping, and the most wonderful shopping malls are not here in the US, they're all in Asia. So there is a good culture for consuming and things like that. So we haven't seen anything in the data to show that that's an issue. Again, these technologies are very disruptive, so you may actually see it. For example, this Grab, which is sort of the Gojek, which is sort of like the Ubers of Southeast, are growing like crazy and they're very popular. So it's a very good question. We don't see it in the short-term numbers, of course. We did actually do analysis about last year on jobs and technology, and we find that actually there's worries that technology and robots are going to take over the jobs. In Asia it doesn't show, and simply because that technology aspect is more than offset by the large growth in the consumption base. So here is a picture of the same thing that I showed you, but we also looked at it by sectors. And one of the interesting things and you can actually see each of the countries, and lo and behold, Malaysia and Vietnam are the countries that would have the largest growth of the
as a percent of GDP. This is the current scenario. So this is already what's happened, the impact of the tariffs that have already happened, right? And you can see that it's not only the sectors that are traded that grow. The services sector, which is the yellow, are also affected. So these show sort of the indirect impact. So, for example, if you're going to have more or less trade of something, then wholesale trade is affected, the transportation sector is affected, the business sector, the business services sector is affected. All these things are indirectly affected. So you can see it's not just hitting the particular sectors that are first affected. And it's basically just to show what could be that medium-term impact. The Hong Kong and Indonesia and Singapore, they do gain a little bit, but practically nothing. I mean, compared to everything else that's happening in Hong Kong and Singapore, these are quite small effects. And then these gains are significantly higher if or bilateral. So here you see, for example, Vietnam is about 0.58 percentage points of GDP. Now we move to the worst case scenario, which is, again, if you have auto and auto parts, 30% bilateral tariffs on bilateral trade, US-China. And now the effect is just that much larger. And you can see by far the largest gainer is Vietnam. And it gains for many reasons. First of all, the redirection occurs not just from US, but from China, and even from other countries that also get their inputs from there. The biggest are textiles, garments, and leather. Leather is a big one because it's used for so many things, and electronics and machinery. So we were talking about uncertainty. We did do a little bit about it, and we see that the problem with uncertainty is not necessarily the size of the tariffs, which is not very big. And as you mentioned, even the impact on GDP is not that large necessarily. It's actually the fact that people don't know what's going to happen, and so investment is on the sidelines. And a lot of the things that's happening too is a lot of the links are being severed. So when a factory says, well, I'm not going to stay here in China, I'm moving in somewhere else, and I'm going to have to find new customers, find new people who will supply my things, that's very disruptive. And that is what's creating this uncertainty effect. So there's a special measure that's called trade policy uncertainty that you can use by using big data. You sort of go for news stories that talk about trade policy uncertainty, and we created this index. And you can see there's been like 2 or 3 spikes before the U.S. trade tensions over intellectual property rights was a bigger spike. Then around the 2000s when China entered the World Trade Organization, now this has completely overtaken this U.S. PRC trade tension. The peak actually occurred in February of 2019. And we actually did some analysis to show what would be the impact of investment in China. And the right-hand side shows that it can have an adverse effect on investment. So for, over after 3 quarters, you actually have to see negative impacts in percent of GDP. So this is where we could actually see bigger impacts, I think is a point to make on this. What about redirection? We already had some data showing that in 2018, especially the latter part of 2018, there was a huge increase in developing Asia's FDI, excluding China, from China and from the US. And we wanted to see how this is following through for 2019. So if you compare, this is investment approvals. So every time that you want to invest in a country, you have to go to the Office of Investment and get an approval from the country to invest. And usually it takes about 2 years when the actual investment actually vests. But you can see what people are thinking and what are people's plans. So we compared that data for the countries that we had the data. We actually had data for more countries, but for these particular, biannual data, we only had it for these 4 countries. You can see that both US and China, here China includes Hong Kong because Hong Kong is used as a conduit a lot, their investment approvals are really rising. So we are already seeing some redirection happening. I think for Vietnam, for example, over the first 7 months, there was a 200% increase in investment approvals just from US and China alone. And what does that mean for the global trade and global balances, and something that I think President Trump seems to be concerned about a lot? Well, because of these issues, and especially because China's export-led growth is falling, we see that in 2020, the contribution of developing Asia and China to the global imbalances is going to be very small. It's going to be practically zero. In fact, we had it for zero before, but there was some revision of our forecast that actually China still has a little bit of a trade surplus. But you can see that the global is the U.S. is really it's a deficit of the U.S. versus the rest of the world, including especially other advanced economies. So what are the downside risks to the outlook? Well, obviously we think they've really increased. In other words, we think that things our forecast, what we think is going to occur, has a higher chance of being worse than what we thought than being better than we thought, we say. Again, further escalation of the U.S.-China trade conflict. We're a little bit less, continue to be skeptical about how much negotiations can do. But there's also a lot of uncertainty, right, about what can happen. I mean, as you know, there's a lot of political issues happening in different countries which can have an effect on the economic side. Deeper malaise in advanced economies. You have some... We show, for example, that there's some charts that show that the U.S. probability of a recession has increased. So things like this could lower our projections further. And rising private debt in developing Asia, which in this chart you can see continues to go up, a little bit less in 2017. And what worries us here also is how quickly it goes up. And the reason why this is important is because if especially China wants to institute fiscal and monetary policy, or any country wants to institute policies to ameliorate the effects of the trade conflict, if they have very high debt like this, they're much more vulnerable to do so. So they're less likely to be able to have aggressive stimulative policies.
Sorry, how much of this is China versus Asia?
This would be, so this is all of developing Asia. So I'd be probably about 60%. I couldn't tell exactly, but obviously it's going to be a big part of the total. So. So I'm almost over for this, but before I left, I wanted to very quickly sort of switch gears and tell you a little bit about the theme chapter that we had in this update on inclusion in Asia's cities. And one of the things that as people who work on urban, there's a lot of economists have generally found a lot of advantages to urbanization, right? There's a lot of what they call agglomeration economies, and the fact that when people are living in cities, there's a thriving situation. It's easier to match suppliers with demanders of schools, of high-skilled labor, and that's where ideas are created, and etc. So a lot of good things in cities, and that's sort of there's a trade-off of that with very densely populated cities that create, for example, issues with congestion and lack of good services because they're just overwhelmed by the density, etc. So that's all. We tried to, in this chapter, have some pronunciation on this. I would say what was innovative in this chapter, my colleagues did, was that they looked at urbanization rates, which is, as you can imagine, a very fast in Asia, of about 3.7% annual increase in urbanization, and also within that urbanization, an increase in population density of a lot of these cities. So what they did is they, usually when you define the city, many studies use administrative boundaries. So there's some boundaries that are created by the bureaucrats that say this is these people here in the city and the people at the other side of the line are in the rural area. And try to do what we call natural cities, which is using nightlight censoring and juxtaposing it with some of the population density numbers. We created what we called natural cities, and they capture the actual urban footprint using nightlight satellite imageries. And here you can see that three important cities. One is Cebu, Philippines, which is in sort of the center of the Philippines. Is how much it's expanded relative to 1992. The same chart in India for the Kolkata area, and also for the Shanghai area, which is just completely expanded in. And out of 100, we had a data set of 1,459 natural cities that we created as a result of that in the Pacific, and the footprint of the population from 2000 to 2016. And there were 476 natural cities, which were spatially independent in 1992, but somehow got connected and became 124 cities, right? So if you have two cities and they connect, they become one city. And these are the ones that we analyzed for a lot of the work that was done in it. So some of them have sort of gotten connected, and so then if you have a certain amount of connection, but maybe just a road, we call them city clusters. And then all of the analysis was done on that. One of the things that was looked at was the most troubling issues, shall we say, in addition to some of the benefits, were the costs, which were congestion and housing affordability. And here you can see the relative congestion index of natural cities. And these were cities that had populations greater than 5 million. And we created a congestion index basically using, knowing where people live and where people work, and using Google Maps to sort of create shall we say, commuting lines and see how long it takes to get a certain distance over different periods relative to the baseline of 3 a.m. in the morning, which is, so in other words, taking away the bias of the fact that you want to account for the fact that there's so many roads in the city. And what you find is that Metro Manila and Kuala Lumpur, Yangon City, and Dhaka have the worst congestion, and all the other countries. This one is, I believe, the average for this is for population greater than 5 million. So there's huge problems with congestion in Asian cities, and so a lot of the chapter is devoted to what kinds of things can be done. It turns out that a lot of the problems is not necessarily roads. Yes, public transport is inadequate. Yes, the urban density is too large. Yes, the cities have grown very quickly, and so people have to live further and further away, all these things. But the other things that seems to matter most is city planning and planning of urban areas, and there's just not enough planning ahead of this, and there's some good and bad examples that are discussed. And the second thing is housing affordability. And basically, this is the price to income ratio, which is sort of adequate for what housing should cost. And 4 would be sort of the average for a for an advanced economy. And you can see that cities in Asia, the ones that we looked at, even regardless of size, are way too expensive, and the square foot affordability is very, very high.
Forgive me for making one observation.
Sure. Yes.
I really worry about a methodology which has Jakarta just above Singapore and way behind all the other cities in Southeast Asia. Somebody who's been to Southeast Asian cities.
I very much agree
Shocked
with
that
you.
Jakarta comes out looking so good.
Right.
By
I
far,
agree with you.
probably
It may
the
be-
worst of all those cities.
I think one of the things that happened is that we do have some cities that are expanding their public transportation. So some of them, for example, I think KL as well.
But this is the
may be
congestion
affected,
index.
right. But
So
that
this
would
is-
affect the congestion during the time that they're being expanded, of course, and not necessarily afterwards, presumably things
It
will
may
get better.
not be on
But I
that.
agree with you very much in that sense, but this is what came out, so I'd have to speak to my colleagues. But I can definitely agree that Metro Manila, where I live, is by far the worst. But this is again just a very, from my cursory observation of, but yes, I would agree. Again, we have to remember that these are natural cities, right? So it may have been that the way that the natural city was defined for Jakarta may just about get rid of some of these hotspots, because if a lot of people are going to Bandung, for example, and Bandung ends up being part of the city or not, then that can have an impact as well. Again, this data is very difficult to get from elsewhere, so we just created it ourselves, but it's far from perfect, but it is it's what we get. So. But anyway, I'll definitely ask them what the colleagues who worked on this to see what they have to say on this. So anyway, thank you very much. This is
Well, we asked questions along the way, but we do have 2 minutes before we because many of us asked along the way. But Dr. Mercer-Blackman, thank you. It's always very good to have Asian Development Bank report and on the update on the update on the outlook, because it's very valuable, and all these issues are very much in the news, being discussed. So it's terrific to have your input. We'll come back to you on cities. East West Center is doing some work in this area, and I'd like to chat with you about that maybe offline. But before we run out of formal time for the program and have to adjourn, is there anyone who has a question for our speaker? Please, yes, please just identify yourself.
David Woods, Council on Competitiveness. With regard to trade wars, there's the other potential one in Asia between Japan and Korea. Could you talk a bit about if there's any research done on that, particularly with regard to how expectations are impacting investment in factory building?
Yeah, no, actually, I happen to have one slide on it. But one of the reasons
That was not a planted question.
That's right. Yeah, I've never
Can
met
you
you
see?
before. So, but actually, because we did have we presented this in Japan, so we thought that something like this would come up. Yeah, we're beginning to see some impacts. Actually, what this chart basically shows is that you have seen trade between the two countries actually fall, and we have actually heard reports that some of the major some of the major goods that trade that is done between Japan and Korea, especially for example companies like Samsung, are quite critical to some of their production. So it is having some effects on that. And it is unfortunate. I think it's this also shows, I think, that some of these countries are scrambling to do like bilateral agreements with other countries. And in fact, some of the we were talking about how US and China are sort of redirecting trade and investment to the rest of the ASEAN countries. Actually, Korea and Japan are also doing the same. And it's not clear how much of it might be related to this, but certainly it's we're beginning to see some impact as well. So yeah.
And was there one back here?
Yeah, I just wanted to know if you're making available these slides.
I could certainly, yes, I'm happy to.
As part of the program, we'll load them up on our website with your permission.
Yes, of course, yeah, that's
and
fine.
make them available so you can go to the link for this program and for the videotape of the program, and the slides will be posted there. That's great. Okay.
And of course, you can always read the report.
And you can-
It has much more detail.
Well, before we formally thank you, let me just make 2 program advertisements, as I want to do. On October 16th, I don't have the calendar in front of me, what day of the week that is.
Wednesday.
Wednesday, thank you, Sarah. Sarah coordinates all our programs and even knows the days of the week, 2 weeks in advance. October 16th, 12:30 to 2 over lunch, Dr. John Blaxland of Australian National University is doing an assessment of Australia's geostrategic situation and the implications for the United States. It's a sort of a part of his alliance study. He's done some very interesting work on the US-Thailand alliance under a Minerva project, and now is turning his attention to strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in Australia's strategic posture, and what that might mean for the bilateral alliance. 2 days later, so that would make it Friday, 10 a.m. in the morning, picking up on Dr. Vikram Nehru of SAIS's question. Dr. Malcolm Cook of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore is going to be giving us an assessment of the U.S. trade successes in Southeast Asia, kind of looking at the conventional wisdom about the U.S. being in decline and displaced by China on the import-export front. This apparently has a data set that I haven't seen all of it, but he's going to be presenting his findings, so if you're interested in that, please join us. And if you're not on our mailing list, I urge you to consider doing so. I can't put anyone on the mailing list, but there's a sign-up sheet outside, or you can hand a card to Sarah or me, and we'll get you on the mailing list for events, publications, fellowship opportunities. And I want to flag in particular, since the theme of this is Asia economic, we have a new US, Japan, Southeast Asia Visiting Fellows program, and it's for young experts who want to spend a month in Tokyo and a month in Washington looking at an area of potential cooperation between US, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Previous projects have looked at water, energy, private sector enterprise, etc. So I would urge you to take a look again at our website and circulate to your friends. With those paid advertisements completed, really, a sincere thanks to ADB, Jeff, and thank you, Dr. Blackman, for coming and giving us presentation.